On October 28, 2021, 25-year-old Mo Willson climbed up onto her bike, pulled her dark goggles down over her eyes, put her feet on the pedals, and sped off down a dirt path in the West Texas town of Marfa. Mo leaned down a bit over her handlebars and adjusted her bike perfectly to the changing rocky terrain on the path. Pretty soon, she heard the tires of another bike grinding through the dirt and rocks right behind her, and when she turned and saw who it was, she broke out in a huge smile. It was a 34-year-old man named Colin Strickland, who was another rider, who pulled his bike right up alongside her, and the two of them started winding their way down the path together. So Mo and Colin were not just two bike riders out here enjoying a bike ride. They were actually both world-class professional gravel racers. This meant they competed against other cyclists from all over in races that took place on all kinds of different tracks. They would race through deserts, in the mountains, and over long distances down steep wooded paths. And the two of them had come here to Marfa, Texas, because it was home to great desert trails with difficult terrain that made it a perfect training ground for top riders like Mo and Colin. But after riding for a while, Mo looked out at the bright orange and red sunset stretching out across the huge West Texas sky, and she felt happy she'd come to Marfa, but for a reason that had nothing to do with her training. Because Marfa had gained a reputation as this perfect place for a romantic getaway. The small town had become home to upscale restaurants, high-end art galleries, and places to stay where visitors could feel like they were secluded from the rest of the world. And Mo was looking forward to being alone there with Colin. The two of them had met about a month earlier at a major gravel cycling race in Idaho. Colin was already considered one of the top male racers in the world, and he was actually a celebrity in the sport. And Mo was well on her way to becoming his counterpart, but in women's racing. Their shared love and commitment to the sport made it easy for them to get along right away. And so shortly after that race in Idaho, when Mo went home to Vermont and Colin went home to Austin, Texas, they started texting and speaking all the time on the phone. And just a few weeks later, Mo had headed to Austin to visit Colin, and at that point, they became romantically involved. Now, their relationship was still new, and Mo wasn't exactly sure where they stood, but she figured a few days alone together in Marfa would go a long way to bringing the two of them closer together. Out on the path, Mo and Colin kept on riding. And during this ride, each of them made sure to take the time and made the effort to hone specific skills that they needed to work on. As fun as this was, they were still very serious competitors, and they both had dreams of being the best in the sport, so they always had to train seriously. And they also both really wanted to serve as ambassadors for gravel racing, so it would continue to grow all over the world. Mo and Colin eventually finished up their training ride and then hopped off their bikes and began to stretch. They were both sweaty and a bit worn out, but now they could get all cleaned up and just spend some time together. And later that night, that's exactly what they did. They relaxed and talked in their room, and everything seemed easy between them. But as they were doing that, Colin got a text message, and Mo could see his whole attitude changed. He tensed up and got this annoyed look on his face and quickly responded to the text. Mo didn't want to press him, but she was pretty sure she knew who had just messaged Colin. Because Mo was aware that he had been seeing another woman, Caitlin Armstrong, before the two of them had started talking and texting. Colin said that he and Caitlin had split up, but it was clear to Mo that Caitlin had not gotten over him. After spending a few perfect days in Marfa, Mo tried hard not to worry too much about Caitlin. However, Mo wasn't naive. She didn't just have Caitlin to contend with. She also had the reality that, trying to maintain any kind of serious relationship with Colin was always going to be difficult. She lived in Vermont, and he lived 2,000 miles away in Texas, and in addition to that, they both traveled a ton for gravel racing competitions, and they didn't always compete at the same locations. So this was a big uphill battle from the start. But when it was time to leave Marfa and go their separate ways, Mo hoped that she and Colin had at least started something special enough that maybe could grow into something bigger in the future, even if they couldn't always be together in the same place. And by the time Mo finally got home to Vermont, she was already looking forward to the next time she could see Colin. At about 4:45 p.m. on May 11th, 2022, so a little more than 6 months after Mo's trip to Marfa, Mo wrapped her arms around Colin's waist on the back of his motorcycle as they sped down a road in Austin, Texas. The last 6 months had not gone exactly as Mo had hoped. After leaving Marfa, she and Colin had both been very busy, traveling and competing, like she knew they would be. But through the end of 2021 and the beginning of 2022, she felt like she and Colin had barely spoken. They texted occasionally, but their conversations really just seemed to be focused on gravel racing and competing. And so Mo began to think that maybe their romantic getaway together in Marfa had just been a one-time affair. But then, about a month ago in April, Mo had begun to hear from Colin a lot more. And he didn't just want to talk about racing. And when Mo had told Colin that she was headed to Austin in May to compete in a race and to spend some time with one of her best friends who lived there, Colin got excited and made it clear he was looking forward to seeing her. So now, on the back of Colin's motorcycle, Mo held on to him a bit tighter as he turned off a main road onto a side street. They whipped through a heavily wooded area, past an artificial lake, and into the parking lot of Deep Eddy Pool, a popular public swimming pool in Austin. Mo and Colin hopped off the motorcycle and went inside. Mo took off her shoes and her cover-up that was over her bathing suit, and she dove right in. And while Mo didn't want to force anything, she was already starting to feel like she and Colin had reconnected here since she'd arrived. So they would spend hours just swimming and talking in the pool, having a great time, and then afterwards they climbed out, got dressed, and then went and got dinner together nearby. A little after 8:30 p.m. that same night, Colin dropped Mo off at her friend's place where she was staying. They said they would see each other at the upcoming race, and then Mo climbed off Colin's motorcycle. She smiled and waved as she walked around the building into the alley. Then she headed up the old wooden staircase that led from the alley to her friend's small second-floor garage apartment. Once inside, Mo checked on her gravel bike that she'd brought with her just to make sure it was ready to go. Once she was satisfied that it was in good shape, she headed to the bathroom to take a shower. But before she could ever turn the water on, she heard the sound of the apartment door opening. About an hour and a half later, so a few minutes before 10 p.m., Mo's friend walked into the apartment and called out for Mo. The friend didn't get a response, and so initially, she thought maybe Mo was still out with Colin. But as she walked further into the apartment, she saw Mo's legs sticking out from the bathroom. And the friend actually smiled, because she knew that sometimes, after a long day of bike riding, Mo liked to stretch out on the cool bathroom floor to recuperate, especially if it was really hot outside, and it had been over 90 degrees Fahrenheit most of that day. So she called Mo's name again, but Mo still didn't say anything. So her friend walked down the hall, and when she got to the bathroom and actually saw Mo, she began to scream, because the bathroom wall and floor were spattered with blood. Mo's friend grabbed her phone and dialed 911. And as soon as she heard the operator, she shouted that her friend was covered in blood and unconscious. The operator said he would send first responders right away, but he also began telling Mo's friend how to perform CPR. And so the friend dropped down and started doing chest compressions on Mo, fighting through tears and begging Mo to wake up, but nothing was working. Within minutes, Mo's friend heard the door open, and a first responder quickly rushed to the bathroom. The friend at this point backed away, and the first responder took over CPR. But it was too late. Mo was pronounced dead at the scene. Late that night, Detective Richard Spittler and Detective Katie Connor of the Austin Police Department walked through the alleyway and up the steps to the second-floor apartment. On their way, they passed by a uniformed police officer who was standing with a young woman who couldn't stop crying. Spittler and Connor passed them and then put on their gloves, stepped inside the apartment, and walked past a few more officers who'd also arrived before them. Spittler and Connor knew that Anna Moriah Willson, a woman in her 20s nicknamed Mo, who'd been visiting from out of state, had been pronounced dead at her friend's apartment, but they really didn't know much more than that. But as soon as they stepped into the doorway of the bathroom, they had a pretty good idea about what had happened. Mo had 3 gunshot wounds in her chest, and amidst the blood surrounding her body, they saw 9mm bullet casings. With all the blood on the walls, the floor, and the body, the detectives knew that the forensics team would have plenty of samples to take, and they thought they already had a pretty clear picture of what had happened to Mo. So, they stepped away from the bathroom and just did a sweep of the apartment. It didn't look like the place had been ransacked in any way, and as far as they could tell, it didn't look like this had been a robbery gone wrong, because expensive electronic equipment had been left untouched. But they still didn't want to jump to any conclusions until they talked to the person who actually lived there. So as the forensics team arrived and got to work, Spittler also sent other officers to canvass the apartment complex and the surrounding area. And then once they were dispatched, he and Detective Connor headed downstairs towards the alley. There, they found the woman who was still crying, and it would turn out she was the owner of the apartment and was Mo's friend. Both detectives felt bad for her, and they knew she'd actually performed CPR on her friend to try to revive her. But right now, despite how much trauma this woman had been through, she was still the only direct link they had to the crime scene. She'd found the victim, and she'd made the 911 call. So, as gently as he could, Spittler told Mo's friend that she would have to come with them to the station for questioning. As the night of May 11th turned into the morning of May 12th, Detective Spittler and Connor sat across from Mo's friend inside of an interview room at the station. The woman was still visibly upset, so the detectives did their best to keep her calm and let her know they were just trying to get a clear picture of what had happened that night. And eventually, Mo's friend began to talk, and she told the detectives that she had found Mo in the bathroom after coming home. And she said that when she had come to her apartment that night, she hadn't heard or seen anything strange outside when she parked her car or when she was walking up the steps. Everything seemed normal. Spittler asked her if she had noticed if anything inside of her apartment appeared to have been stolen. Mo's friend thought about it and then said nothing of hers had been taken. However, Mo's very expensive specialty gravel racing bicycle was gone, and she said there was no way that Mo would have taken it somewhere and just left it. Because Mo not only loved that bike, but literally needed it for an upcoming race. The detectives shared a look. They both realized this could mean that Mo's murder had been the result of a robbery gone wrong. But since the expensive bike was the only thing taken, Spittler thought that most likely pointed to someone who would have known Mo was in town and that she'd brought her bike with her. So, Spittler asked if anybody else knew that Mo was staying at the apartment and that she might have brought her bike. And Mo's friend said that actually a bunch of people knew, because Mo was a big-time gravel racer, and a large number of cyclists who knew her were in town to compete at an upcoming race. But Mo's friend did quickly add that the only person she knew Mo had seen that day was a cyclist that Mo had an on-again, off-again relationship with, a guy who was famous in gravel racing circles named Colin Strickland. Several hours later, still on the morning of May 12th, Detective Spittler and several other officers drove towards Colin Strickland's house in Austin. After working through the night, Spittler and Connor had begun to believe that the man Mo had been out with the day before was their only legitimate lead. They'd taken DNA samples from Mo's friend who'd found Mo, and while they weren't willing to write anyone off yet as a suspect, neither detective really believed she was the killer. On top of that, the detectives' early theory that Mo's murder could have been a robbery gone wrong had already taken a significant hit. Because as officers had canvassed the surrounding area, they'd found Mo's missing bike, abandoned in a thick growth of bamboo, less than 70 feet away from the apartment where Mo had been killed. The one other piece of possible evidence they'd found had come from video doorbell footage from an apartment near the crime scene that showed a black Jeep Cherokee with a large bike rack driving towards Mo's friend's place not long before Mo had most likely been killed. But the police couldn't get a clear read on the license plate number or a clear look at the driver. So, while Detective Connor stayed behind at the station and tried to track down the Jeep, Spittler and his team pulled up their cars to Colin Strickland's house. And when Spittler glanced out of his window, he almost wanted to laugh because he couldn't believe his luck. Parked right out in front of the house was a black Jeep Cherokee with a large bike rack, just like the one in the video footage. The sight of the Jeep gave Spittler a rush, and he thought this was almost too good to be true. But he didn't want Colin to panic and do something stupid. And as much as this car made it seem like there was a good chance Spittler had just found his killer, he did not want to rush to judgment. So when Colin opened the door calmly and said he was willing to speak to the police, Spittler played everything very close to the vest. And so he started his interview with the most basic questions he could think of. He asked Colin if he knew a woman who was a professional cyclist named Anna, and Colin said no, he didn't know anybody by that name. And this actually blew Spittler away, because it was such a blatant lie that Spittler easily could have refuted, even if he hadn't already heard from her friend that Colin and Mo had a close relationship. In fact, in less than a day, Spittler and his team had found online references to Colin and Mo being at multiple races across the country at the same time. And it was also clear to Spittler that the world of professional gravel racing was a pretty small one. So there was no logical way that one of the top racers on the men's side never would have come across one of the top racers on the women's side. But Spittler didn't show any of that on his face. Instead, he told Colin the woman in question, Anna, had the last name of Willson and was a gravel rider. And at this, Colin's face suddenly changed, like he was only just now remembering Mo's given name, Anna. And he said, actually, yeah, I do know her. Then the detective told Colin that, well, Mo had died the night before, and now Colin's expression changed again. He leaned over and just started rubbing his face and neck. Spittler didn't know what to make of this. Colin did look upset, but at the same time, he had just acted like he didn't know who Anna was, as if he literally didn't know that the woman he had been intimate with, Mo, that her actual first name was Anna. I guess it was possible, but realistically, if you're being intimate with this person, you probably know their real first name. But maybe he forgot, but it was just all very suspicious. So, after a moment, Spittler told Colin they would need to take him to the station for further questioning. Spittler knew he didn't have anything to hold Colin on yet, but he didn't want to risk Colin fleeing, and he needed more time because he wanted to get a search warrant for Colin's house. As they walked outside together, Spittler asked Colin if the black Jeep Cherokee belonged to him, and Colin said no, it belonged to his girlfriend who lived with him, Caitlin Armstrong. So Spittler asked if Colin ever drove it, and Colin laughed and said no, wasn't really his style. He said he liked to drive motorcycles and big diesel trucks. Spittler smiled and nodded like it was no big deal, but deep down he knew that Colin could easily be lying here. It was just as likely that, he was at Mo's friend's house the night before, driving that Jeep Cherokee. But right now, it was Colin's word against his. After a short drive, Detective Spittler arrived at the station. While his suspect, Colin Strickland, was taken to an interview room, Spittler told his partner, Detective Connor, about how he'd found the black Jeep with the bike rack on it. It was Colin's live-in girlfriend's car, Caitlin Armstrong. And Detective Connor seemed shocked, not because she was surprised about the Jeep, but because she'd also discovered something huge about Caitlin. While she and the rest of the team were searching for the Jeep and, naturally digging into Colin Strickland's background because he was someone who was seeing Mo, they had discovered his and Caitlin's relationship. And a quick search of a police database showed that police had an outstanding arrest warrant for Caitlin. Because years earlier, Caitlin had gone in to get Botox done at a place in town, and she had agreed to pay for it, she got the services done, but then at the end, when she was actually told to cough up the money, $650, she had run out without paying. Spittler could barely contain his excitement, because this meant they could bring Caitlin in and hold her on that warrant, even if they didn't have enough evidence to hold her in Mo's murder case yet. And that just meant they would have more time to look into her possible connection to the murder. Or at the very least, they would have leverage on her. And if she maybe knew something about her boyfriend, Colin Strickland's potential involvement in Mo's murder, she might be more willing to give up that information. As the detectives talked, they found it hard to believe how quickly things were coming together. In the course of just a single day, they'd already moved in on 2 primary suspects, and it really looked like the doorbell camera footage of the Jeep, along with all the ample circumstantial evidence, pointed to one or both of these people. Shortly after that, officers were able to track down Caitlin at work. They brought her into the station, and at that point, the detectives split up. Spittler continued his conversation with Colin that they had started back at the house, while Caitlin was brought to a separate interview room to sit down with Detective Connor. By this point, Caitlin knew about Mo's death, so Detective Connor didn't waste any time. She went right after Caitlin about her Jeep. Connor said they had footage that showed Caitlin's car driving right near Mo's friend's apartment soon before the murder took place. But Caitlin proved to be very calm and cooperative. She didn't deny that she'd been driving in the area where Mo had been murdered, but she said she had nothing to do with Mo's death. Still, she couldn't really provide the detective with any real reason why she had just happened to be right by the apartment at that time. And while Caitlin never lost her cool, Connor did notice a change in her voice and body language when the subject of Mo's relationship with her boyfriend came up. Caitlin started to sound like a jealous girlfriend. She began talking about how she and Colin had broken up for a short period of time, and it was during that time that Colin apparently had begun seeing Mo a little bit, and it just clearly rattled Caitlin. And by the end of the interview, Detective Connor flat out told Caitlin that the evidence did not make things look good for her, and Caitlin just sort of nodded in agreement. And Detective Connor didn't really know what to make of it. Caitlin didn't confess to anything, but also didn't really defend herself. She just kind of accepted that she was being looked at seriously as a suspect in a murder case, and didn't really put up much of a defense. And while the Jeep footage was pretty damning on its own, realistically, it was not clear in the video who was driving. But by this point, Connor believed if she and Spittler could secure even just one more piece of evidence to connect Caitlin to the crime scene, in addition to the Jeep, that would be more than enough to arrest her for Mo's murder. In the days following the interviews with Caitlin and Colin, police did obtain a search warrant for their house. And inside the house, they found 2 9mm pistols, which matched the type of bullet casing found at the crime scene. Now, all they had to do was wait a few days for the ballistics report to come in to see if one or even both of those guns had fired the rounds that killed Mo. On May 14th, so 3 days after Mo's death, the race that she had actually come to Austin to take part in went ahead as scheduled. But the race quickly turned into a kind of memorial for Mo. For the opening portion of the race, the riders all rode slowly and stayed together in a pack, placing their hands on each other's backs, while others openly sobbed on the course. And when the winner on the men's side of the race crossed the finish line, he didn't celebrate. Instead, he took off his helmet and bowed his head. He would later post on Instagram, quote, "A normal victory salute was inappropriate on a day like this." But as riders from all across the country used that race in Austin as a way to honor and celebrate the life of Mo Willson, a person most of them considered a friend who they loved and respected, there was one rider whose absence seemed to cast a shadow over everything. Colin Strickland, one of the most popular competitors in the world, and someone who people clearly saw had a relationship with Mo, even if it was just a friendly one, had not shown up. And 3 days later, on May 17th, the detectives read over the ballistics report at the station, and as they did, both of their faces lit up. Because it was clear in the report that one of the guns found in Colin and Caitlin's house was the murder weapon. Following that ballistics report, Spittler and Connor felt a mix of excitement and relief. They believed that in less than a week, they had basically cracked Mo Willson's murder case. They still weren't sure if either Colin or his girlfriend Caitlin had acted alone, or if maybe they had killed Mo together. But they felt confident they now had more than enough evidence to charge them both. The murder weapon had been found in their house, and police had footage of Caitlin's black Jeep driving near Mo's friend's apartment soon before the murder took place. And in addition to that concrete evidence, the detectives had also caught Colin in what appeared to be a lie. When he was first approached about who Anna was, he said he didn't know who she was. But then when they mentioned that her nickname was Mo, Colin was like, "Oh, now I know who it is." But it's like, you were in a relationship with her. You had to know what her first name was. So there was that. And then also the fact that Caitlin, in her interview, seemed very much like a jealous girlfriend whenever Mo came up. And then finally, detectives had conducted interviews of people in the gravel racing community who spoke openly about the potential love triangle between the victim and the 2 suspects. So, as far as Connor or Spittler were concerned, either one or both of their suspects would soon be going away to prison for a very long time. But before Spittler and Connor were able to wrap up everything and hand the case over to the district attorney, their investigation, which had been incredibly straightforward so far, took a bizarre turn that neither of them saw coming. In late June, about a month after Mo's murder, Austin police got word from a small group of United States Marshals who were working in Costa Rica. The Marshals told the detectives that they were on the trail of a fugitive named Ari Martin, and they believed that Ari was involved in the murder of Mo Willson. On the morning of Wednesday, June 29th, 2022, over a month and a half after Mo's death, U.S. Marshal Amir Perez walked down the street in a small coastal town called Santa Teresa in Costa Rica, dressed in a Hawaiian shirt, like a tourist. Perez and his small band of marshals had been desperately trying to track down the wanted American fugitive named Ari Martin for over a month. They had spent the last week here in this touristy town, with bars and shops and yoga studios. Right now, Perez was holding up his cell phone with a picture of Ari pulled up on the screen, and he was checking the face of every woman that passed by him to look for a resemblance. But he was having a bizarre problem. and that was that a lot of the women he passed looked like Ari Martin. So Ari was an attractive woman, but she was strangely generic looking, with no unique features really at all. And so this made her somewhat forgettable for the people that interacted with her. And it also made it very hard to pick her out of a crowd, because basically in any crowd, there were at least 3 other women who sort of looked like her. But today, Perez was not just canvassing. He was on his way to a specific location, a cheap hostel he was hoping Ari might be staying at. And after a half-a-block walk, he found it. He turned off the sidewalk and walked inside the building. Then, pretending to be a tourist looking to meet someone, he walked through the hostel out onto a back patio where there were several tables and people were sitting and talking and drinking. And sitting at one of these tables, Perez saw a generic-looking woman who was speaking English. Perez started to get excited, and he looked down at the photo on his phone, but he still couldn't quite tell if this woman was actually a match. He needed to get closer to be sure. So Perez approached the table, he smiled, and began speaking in Spanish. And at this point, the generic-looking American looked up and smiled at him. And while the smile was, like the rest of her, sort of unremarkable, Perez saw one marking that none of the other women he'd looked at had possessed. And what it was a bandage across this woman's nose. And at this point, Perez knew he had found Ari Martin. With more help from Costa Rican authorities, Perez and his team would soon get Ari back to America. And in Austin, Texas, Detective Spittler and Connor would get to sit down with Ari. And through their conversation, they would learn exactly what had happened to Mo Willson, and they would finally be able to close one of the strangest murder cases any of them had ever worked. Based on information provided by the fugitive Ari Martin, evidence found in the United States and Costa Rica, and interviews conducted throughout the investigation, the following is what police believe happened to Mo Willson on the night she was killed, May 11th, 2022. That night, around 9:15 p.m., the killer walked through the alley and climbed the steps up to the second-floor apartment. The killer thought being in the alley would keep them mostly out of sight, but they still wore all black just to be safe. Even though the sun had set, it was still very hot outside, and the killer could feel sweat dripping down their face. They used their sleeve to wipe their face, then they drew a 9mm pistol from their waistband and opened the door. As slowly and quietly as they could, the killer walked into the apartment and made their way down the hall. At some point, they stopped and looked over at the high-end gravel racing bike leaning up against the wall. Eventually, they kept on moving down the hall, and as they did, they heard something coming from the bathroom. They stopped and looked over at the bathroom door, and they saw light coming out from underneath. Clearly, somebody was in there. At this point, the killer grabbed their gun tightly and took a few more steps until they were stopped right in front of the bathroom door. There, they took a steadying breath, raised their gun, then reached out with their offhand and opened up the door. Inside the bathroom, Mo saw their killer and she screamed, but before Mo could do anything, the killer fired off 2 shots from their pistol. The bullet struck Mo directly in the chest, and she fell to the floor on her back as blood spattered the walls. The killer walked over and just stood over Mo, staring down for a few seconds, seeing all this blood run from her wounds onto the ground. Then, the killer raised their gun again, aimed it at Mo's chest, and fired for a 3rd time. After that, Mo lay motionless on the bathroom floor. For a few moments, the killer just stood there, staring down at Mo, trying to make sure she really was dead. And when she continued to lay there motionless, the killer felt confident she was. So, they turned around and headed back into the hallway. There, they grabbed Mo's expensive bike that was leaning up against the wall, and with it in hand, they moved as quickly as they could back towards the door. The bike was cumbersome to move, but the killer managed to handle the outside stairs quickly and rushed into the alley with the bike. Then they ran through the darkness to a spot they knew was covered with a thick growth of bamboo. The killer then tossed Mo's bike into the bamboo, hoping it would hide it and convince the police that Mo had been killed for her expensive bike. Once the bike had been ditched, the killer took a deep breath, then ran out of the alley and hopped into the black Jeep Cherokee that was parked nearby. Once in the car, they hit the gas and sped away across town. From the beginning, Mo's murder had seemed pretty straightforward to Spittler and Connor. But it was in the days following the interviews with their main suspects, Colin Strickland and his girlfriend Caitlin Armstrong, that had sent their investigation down a path the detectives never could have predicted. Because before any arrests could be made, the detectives discovered that Moe's killer had actually fled Austin. And it was not until a month later, when the U.S. Marshals conducted their search in Costa Rica for the fugitive Ari Martin, that everything would finally come together. Because when U.S. Marshal Amir Perez found Ari at the hostel in the small coastal town, he knew he was actually looking at Moe's killer, who was none other than Caitlin Armstrong herself. Here's what happened. During Caitlin's interview with Detective Connor, police had wanted to hold Caitlin on the arrest warrant that had been issued when she ran out on a bill for $650, which had been for that Botox treatment. But it would turn out that arrest warrant apparently had listed Caitlin's date of birth incorrectly. And so it was deemed invalid, and Caitlin was released from jail that very day. And in the time between her release and when the police got the ballistics report back from the guns found in Caitlin and Colin's house, Caitlin moved fast. She immediately sold her Jeep and used some of that money to quickly get out of Texas and head north to Newark, New Jersey. She wiped all of her social media accounts, got rid of her cell phone, and then flew from Newark to Costa Rica. And once she'd made it to Costa Rica, she began going by several different pseudonyms before landing on Ari Martin. Once police discovered Caitlin had made a run for it, they were more convinced than ever that she was the killer. But finding her proved to be very difficult. And this was because Caitlin had not just changed her name, she also went ahead and changed her face. She'd gotten plastic surgery to intentionally erase her individuality and make her look like lots of other women. But while the surgery did make her look somewhat generic, it also left her with a bandage over her nose. And that's how U.S. Marshal Perez finally identified her. The Marshals brought Caitlin back to Austin, and there she eventually confessed to murdering Moe. Colin Strickland was not involved in any way with Moe's murder. Caitlin Armstrong was convicted of murder and sentenced to 90 years in prison with a chance for parole in 2053. On September 19, 2013, 69-year-old retired middle school teacher Amy Linkert and her friend, 63-year-old Joe Blakesley, who was a physician, headed off to the Craters on the Moon Park in Idaho. This park is actually a dormant volcano. It's not extinct. It's going to be active again probably in the next 1,000 years. But for now, it's this beautiful park that is known for these crazy lava fields that look otherworldly. Barely any vegetation can grow on them, and there's just a strip of pavement they've kind of weaved through these massive jagged lava fields. And then you have all these big mounds that are the actual volcanoes. Another feature of this park are all the lava tubes underground. All the molten lava, when it jets around underneath the surface before shooting out, it carves these natural tunnels underground, these huge caverns. They're like these big caves you can explore. And there's 1,100 miles of lava tubes, tunnels, and caves underneath this park. The two women told their families they would be back in Boise, Idaho by the 21st, but when the 21st came and they were not home, their families were suspicious. They tried calling them, they didn't pick up. And for the next 36 hours, they just kept trying to call them and, called around to see if anybody else knew where they were. And then finally, on the morning of the 23rd, when no one knew where they were, they reached out to the authorities. The formal search for these two women began on the 24th, so 5 days after they had initially left for this trip. And the searchers quickly found their pickup truck parked in the parking lot of the Craters on the Moon Park. And in their truck were their two dogs, who were alive, they were okay. And in the front seat were their purses and their cell phones, but there was no sign of Amy or Joe. This was obviously a bad sign, and so the search was really kicked into high gear to see if they could find these women before it was too late. But unfortunately, within 24 hours of finding the truck, they would find Amy's body. And her body was located way off of the main trail. She was in an area that the park superintendent described as incredibly rugged and inaccessible. Now, at this park, there is a strip of cement that weaves through this really dangerous lava field. And if you were on this strip of cement, you wouldn't be thinking about walking onto the lava field. Not only would you need to navigate all these massive mounds of jagged, cooled lava, there's all these cracks in the ground that you could fall through and just plummet to your death. So no one's about to start walking off the trail, especially not two older women that went here just to have a casual stroll through the park. They were not there for some grand adventure. They were not athletic distance hikers. It made no sense that Amy would be so far off the trail in an area that was so dangerous and so clearly off limits. When the families were notified that Amy had been found and they were still looking for Joe, the detail that the family keyed in on was the idea that these two women left their dogs in the truck. That was something so unbelievably uncharacteristic of either of them. They adored those two dogs. They would never, ever abandon them like that. In fact, because of that detail, the families jumped to this has to be foul play because they never would have done that. They wouldn't have abandoned these precious dogs. The search for Joe would continue. They basically shifted the entire effort to center over Amy where she was found and work in circles out from there to see if they could find her. They had helicopters flying overhead. They had mining experts walking through all the lava tubes below, and they couldn't find her. Finally, on October 23rd, so 28 days after Amy was found, Joe's body was discovered as well. And she was lying 1 mile away from where Amy had been found in a similarly inaccessible part of the park that would have required significant climbing over jagged, cooled lava fields and all these cracks in the ground she would have had to navigate to reach where she was. And even more strangely is the area where she was found had been searched extensively by air with helicopter pilots flying overhead and by cadaver sniffing dogs that had been in that area and they had not picked up her scent. So either the helicopter pilots and the cadaver sniffing dogs were just wrong or missed something, or Joe had not been there the whole time. A cause of death has not been determined for either of the two women. However, what was released is neither of them appeared to have suffered an incapacitating injury, meaning they weren't struck down where they were. They were traveling and ultimately stopped where they were. It seems highly unlikely that these two women abandoned their two dogs and left their cell phones in the car and then wandered way off the trail and separated from each other, all without supplies. But even if they had done that, even if they had, separated and left the trail, where they ultimately reached seems like an area they would not have been able to get to without assistance. And since they were separated, they weren't able to help each other get where they were. So although authorities have ruled out foul play, this was deemed an accident, it does seem like if there was ever a place to commit an attack, it would be this particular park, because underneath the park is 1,100 miles of lava tubes that connect to each other and weave all through the park, and there's hundreds of caves, many of which have not been found or explored, that it would be pretty straightforward to attack someone and then go underground and not be found. Certainly makes you wonder who or what could be hiding underground in those lava tubes. Our next story is called Stay in the Car. Before dawn on December 12, 1992, a 17-year-old girl named Tracy Dion sat in the passenger seat of a little two-door car that was swerving down a deserted road in the Yankton Sioux Reservation in South Dakota. Everybody in the car was drunk, including Tracy. Sitting next to Tracy in the middle front seat was her 19-year-old cousin named Ruby, and Ruby's boyfriend, a 20-year-old named Arnold, was driving the car. All three of them had been out partying all night, and so now they were trying to make it home. The swerving was making Tracy feel sick to her stomach, but she didn't want to say anything to Arnold in fear that she might distract him. It was really dark outside, there was no streetlights, there was ice on the road. For a sober driver, this would be a challenging drive, let alone a drunk driver. They were coming up on an intersection, and Arnold brought the car to a stop with a lurch. Tracy watched as Arnold checked for cross traffic and then pulled out onto Highway 281. But halfway through this turn, as Arnold was accelerating, Tracy began to feel the car slide. And even in her drunken state, she could tell Arnold had hit a patch of black ice. And so as the car began to skid, she wanted to scream. Before she could, the car was already flipping over, and then everything went black. A short time later, Tracy came to. The car was upside down, and Tracy quickly realized she had fallen out of her seat and was now basically resting on the roof of the car, which was now on the ground. From what she could tell, after the car had finished rolling over, it had come to a stop just off the side of the highway, and so they were not in immediate danger from other cars striking them. But she couldn't really see outside because the windows were so badly cracked. Beside her, Tracy could hear her cousin, Ruby, pounding on the driver's side door trying to get it to open, and so Tracy tried to look around Ruby to see Arnold to see if he was okay, but when she did, she saw the driver's seat was empty. Tracy tried to make sense of what she was seeing. The driver's side door was closed, but Arnold was gone. Just then, Tracy heard the sound of the driver's side door opening, and she turned to see her cousin Ruby forcing the door open just a few inches, and then a second later, Ruby was slithering out through that crack to the outside. To Tracy, everything felt like it was happening in slow motion. She was too shocked and confused to make any sense of it. But if Ruby was getting out of the car, Tracy felt like she should too. And so Tracy turned and crawled across to the driver's side and was about to make an exit the same way Ruby had when the door slammed shut violently right in Tracy's face. Tracy didn't understand why Ruby would do something like that. Why would she shut the door that aggressively when she knew her cousin was still inside? Tracy tried to open the door again, but she was too weak to do it. She figured her cousin Ruby was okay, but she couldn't see outside because of how cracked the windows were. At this point, Tracy began to feel woozy. She laid her head down on the roof of the car, wondering to herself why Ruby and Arnold had left her behind. Tracy would stay trapped inside of the car, alone, for a few hours, until finally a motorist saw the flipped-over car and called 911. Shortly after that, first responders arrived on the scene, they pulled Tracy out of the car, and shockingly, she actually didn't have really any serious injuries at all. She didn't even need to be hospitalized. But rescuers could not find Ruby or Arnold anywhere. They were gone. And once rescuers had scoured the entire area around the crash site, the sheriff who was in charge of the scene started to wonder if Arnold and Ruby were not just missing. Maybe, he thought, they had fled. Arnold had been driving drunk, and all three of them were underage, and so the sheriff thought maybe Arnold and Ruby were scared to get in trouble. Over the next few days, the police continued to search the surrounding area for Arnold and Ruby, hoping they were not badly injured and that they would just turn up on their own, but they never did. And as the days turned into weeks, hope began to wane for the young couple. Their family and friends kept searching the area along 281 where the car had flipped, looking for any clue as to where these two had gone. But there was nothing. There was no trace of them. It was like Arnold and Ruby had gotten out of the car and just vanished. But in January of 1993, so 3 weeks after the crash, strange and conflicting reports of sightings began to trickle in. First, a woman came forward claiming to have seen Arnold, alive and well, at a New Year's Eve party. Now, the police doubted this claim, but this woman was insistent that she had seen Arnold. And they actually hooked her up to a lie detector test, and she passed the test. And so officials brought in guests from this party who this woman claimed were with Arnold, and they asked them, "Were you with Arnold?" And they said no, but they failed their lie detector tests. Now, of course, this was suspicious, but police really didn't know what to do with this information. Assuming this woman's story was true, that she really did see Arnold, well, according to the details of her story, Arnold did not appear to be in any kind of distress. And even if he was in distress, the police still had no idea where he was, so how could they help him? Other locals came forward, claiming to have spotted Arnold around town as well. But nothing came of those reports either. Neither Arnold nor Ruby turned up. Months went by, and the case went cold. Until March 10th, when a driver was going down Highway 281 and they noticed a strange object in the drainage ditch next to the road. By now, the weather was much warmer than it had been on the day of the crash, so instead of snow and ice inside of this drainage ditch, it was runoff water. And the strange object was floating in it. The driver stopped his car, got out, and walked up to see what this thing was, and as soon as he saw it, he turned, ran back to his car, and called the police. Because what the driver had just found was a dead body. And when the police arrived and searched the area, they found another body not far away. The bodies belonged to Ruby and Arnold. But this discovery did not solve the mystery of what happened to Ruby and Arnold. Instead, it made it much more bizarre. Because first of all, the bodies were found 75 feet away from the original crash site. And the exact spots where the two bodies were found had been searched many, many times on the day of the crash, days after the crash. They were searched by police, they were searched by friends and family of Ruby and Arnold. The idea that this is where the bodies had been the whole time was impossible. They would have been found. And then there was the condition of the bodies. Ruby's body was extremely decomposed, which made sense given the fact that the crash was 3 months earlier. But Arnold's body was barely decomposed at all. And in the pocket of Arnold's jeans, police found a mysterious set of 3 keys. 1 was a vehicle key and 2 were house keys. But none of them opened any vehicle or building that Arnold was known to frequent, and nobody recognized them. Finally, the police found a tuft of hair lying near where the bodies had been found. It was Ruby's hair, but it didn't look like the hair had been there for very long, certainly not 3 months. Instead of being dirty and matted, like you would expect given how long she must have been there, the hair was perfectly clean. The official coroner's report on Ruby and Arnold's deaths were that they died of exposure, and then their bodies were just overlooked by searchers for months. But to a lot of people, including the sheriff who was in charge of the original crash site, this made no sense. Despite the coroner's findings, law enforcement officials believed that Ruby and Arnold's deaths were the result of foul play. Under the foul play theory, somebody pulled Ruby and Arnold out of the crash site while they were still alive and then killed them later. And then perhaps they killed them at different times, which would account for the differences in decomposition of their bodies. The FBI ultimately came in and took over this case, but they eventually closed it down, citing a lack of evidence to support the foul play theory. However, with or without foul play being involved here, nobody has a good explanation for all those sightings of Arnold after the crash. And also, nobody can explain why the door was slammed in Tracy's face in the immediate aftermath of the crash. Maybe it was Ruby or Arnold who slammed the door, or maybe it was their killer. To this day, what actually happened on December 12, 1992, on the side of Highway 281 remains a mystery. The third and final story of today's episode is called What Just Happened. Growing up, Colton Louder was a joy to be around. He was always goofing off and making people smile, and he had a really infectious laugh. But secretly, he was depressed and began self-medicating at a very young age. By the time he was 18, he was a full-fledged drug addict, and by the time he was 25, he was in jail on a life sentence for murdering his uncle over a drug-related dispute. Colton's actions had a profound impact on his family, but none more so than on his twin sister, Kaylin. She had known about his pain even when he was putting on that facade of being happy and bubbly and outgoing, and she had reached out to him and tried to help him, but she could never get through to him, and when he was ultimately convicted, it was crushing to her. She felt like she couldn't help someone who was really vulnerable. But instead of just feeling bad about this, she took her sadness about her brother and watching him spiral and turned that into a laser focus on helping other vulnerable people that were struggling with addiction and depression to try to help them before they end up like her brother. And eventually she would get her degree in social work from Utah State. But despite Kaylin's best intentions to want to help as many people as she could, she found it very difficult to find work in her field, and it wasn't uncommon for her to have fairly long stretches of unemployment. And it was during one of those long stretches in 2014 that Kaylin's life rapidly fell apart, and it left everybody who knew her thinking, what just happened? On September 26, 2014, a little after 9 p.m., Kaylin calls 911. She reported that there was this huge, brutal fight taking place in her condo's clubhouse. Basically, it was like a restaurant where you could rent it out in the first floor of this condo complex. And she said it was getting out of hand and police needed to come over here and stop it before someone got hurt. The police asked her if weapons were involved. Were people using weapons in this fight? And Kaylin says, yes, guns. But when police rush to the scene, bracing for the worst, they discover that it's just a docile wedding reception happening inside of this clubhouse, and not one person in there reported any altercation happening. They were like, we're being pretty quiet. I don't know where she would have got that from. One guest would tell police that they had lit off a single firecracker, but they showed them what they had used, and they were these little tiny cheap things that made almost no noise. So it is possible that Kaylin could have mistaken that for a gunshot, but it does seem highly unlikely. Police leave, and then 1 hour later, Kaylin calls 911 again, but she immediately hangs up as soon as an operator has actually answered the phone. And the operator calls the number back, and Kaylin picks the phone up, but she's not really speaking. She's mumbling, she sounds confused, and the operator said, hey, you tried to call 911 a minute ago. Is everything okay? Can you tell me where you are? And Kaylin would have a really hard time giving her address to the police. It was like she couldn't remember her address. And she's mumbling, and at some point she says, my roommate thinks I'm delusional and paranoid, but I'm not. Kaylin eventually kind of calmed down and said she was sorry for calling 911, and the operator said okay, and they hung up, and that was the end of the call. The next morning, Kaylin calls 911 for a third time in 24 hours. This time, she's frantic. While she's on the phone with the operator, she's periodically screaming at these two people that are apparently robbing her apartment to get the F out of here, get out of my apartment, you can't be here. And the operator is trying to get more information out of Kaylin, but Kaylin is very distressed. She can barely communicate with the operator. She's half crying, and the operator tells her, can you leave? Can you go somewhere safe? And Kaylin says, no, there's only one way out. This is a small apartment. I can't go past them. And the operator tells them that police are on their way. Just stay in your bedroom. Don't go anywhere. And so while Kaylin is huddled in her bedroom and the dispatcher is still on the line listening, you hear Kaylin's roommate, Carol, walk into her bedroom and very calmly say, Kaylin, what's going on? And Kaylin's like, Carol, get over here. You gotta lock the door. Get in here. There's two people in here. They're robbing us. They're out there. They're in the other room. And Carol's like, no, there's no one here. The front door's locked. Kaylin suddenly sounds really confused, and she says, well, I can't explain that, but they must have been in here because I heard them. They must have had a key, and that's how they got in, and that's how they got out. And right at that moment, the responding officers show up, and there was no sign of a break-in. Nothing had been taken. It really looked like nothing had happened, unless someone really did have a key. At this point, Kaylin was very embarrassed. She apologized to the officers, she apologized to her roommate, and she ended up calling her mom and saying, I'm mortified. I can't believe I just called 911 3 different times and nothing came of any of these calls. Like, I feel so embarrassed about it. And her mom, being a good mom, told her, don't worry about it. No one got hurt in the process, so it's all good. And so Kaylin moves past it, and on the call with her mom, she starts talking about what she's going to do that day. She says, well, I'm looking to update my resume and submit it to a couple different job openings, and I also want to clean up my apartment. And so they hang up the phone, and everything seems normal again. But at about 5:45 p.m. that night, Kaylin, along with her beloved little dog named Phyllis that apparently she took everywhere with her, were seen exiting the condo and walking out to the parking lot behind their building. Kaylin was barefoot, was only wearing a tank top and shorts, despite the fact that it was cold and raining. And as soon as she puts her dog down, because she was holding her dog in her arm, Kaylin begins having this totally animated discussion, except there's no one there for her to be talking to. About 15 minutes later, she and her dog turn around and walk back towards the condo complex out of view of a camera, but residents would say they saw her crying and going up to a gate that lets you back into the condo, and she apparently couldn't open it. And as she's standing there struggling, she suddenly stops, puts her dog down, turns, and starts running away. And the camera footage we have of her is only when she's back in the parking lot, but she's running away still, and the dog is nowhere to be found. Her beloved dog, she's abandoned, she's got no phone, no wallet, and nobody knows where she's going. Later that night, when Kaylin's family could not get in touch with her, because of all the weirdness around those 911 calls, her family just had a bad feeling about it, and so they filed an official missing person report that night. When police arrived at the condo complex, the first thing they did is they reviewed the security footage. And they already knew about her 3 911 calls that had happened within 24 hours, and all of them had been for unfounded reasons. And they see Kaylin on camera, barefoot in a tank top and shorts in the rain, and she's having this animated discussion with nobody before running around and running away. And so police go to Kaylin's family and they say, does your daughter have a drug problem? Is she mentally ill? And her family tells the police, no, she's got no history of mental illness. She definitely does not have a drug addiction because of what happened to her brother, and they explain what happened with Colton and how that had a tremendous impact on her, and how that had actually sent her on a course to help people with mental illness or people who are fighting against addiction or depression. And they explained how she was just really well adjusted and everything seemed okay until these 911 calls started, and now this. So this huge search is launched between the police and volunteers, and actually the Louder family even hired some private investigators to help them look for Kaylin. But days turned into weeks and there was no leads, no one knew where she was. She had just vanished. Then on December 1st, 10 weeks after she went missing, city workers were inspecting drainage pipes down near the Jordan River, which was a river that went by her apartment, and they discovered behind some plants a body that was half submerged, and it would turn out to be Kaylin's. They pull her out of the water, and no cause of death could be accurately determined because of how long she had been in the water for. It looked like she had been in there for probably all of the 10 weeks she had been missing. They were able to determine that there were no drugs in her system and there was no water in her lungs, which meant she didn't drown. Her body was found 5 miles from where her apartment was, and so initial speculation was she must have gotten hurt and fallen into this river and drifted the 5 miles downstream to where she was found. But they looked at that section of the river between her apartment and where she was found, and the water was simply too shallow and windy, and it would not have been possible for a human body to travel that distance. Which means almost immediately after she ran off screen on the security footage, she covered those 5 miles, wound up at that section of the Jordan River, died, and then fell in the water, or fell in the water and then died, but not via drowning. The police officially ruled Kaylin's death an accident, but her family disagrees. They say if you look really closely at the security footage right before she runs away, it looks like she's terrified. More specifically, it looks like she's terrified of someone we can't see on camera. When she's having that animated discussion where it looks like she's talking to no one, further feeding the idea that she had kind of lost it, well, there's this huge rock to the right in the video that kind of obscures our view, and behind that is this huge forest. And it is theoretically possible that someone could be back there that we can't see. But no matter what, her family believes that whatever she was doing in her final moments on camera is the key to understanding why she ran off and ultimately died. So you be the judge. Was this a psychotic break, or is there something more?
A quick note about our stories: they are all based on true events, but we sometimes use pseudonyms to protect the people involved, and some details are fictionalized for dramatic purposes. The Mr. Ballin podcast, Strange, Dark, and Mysterious Stories, is hosted and executive produced by me, Mr. Ballin. Our head of writing is Evan Allen. Our head of production is Zach Levitt. Produced by Jeremy Bone. Research and fact-checking by Shelley Shue, Samantha Van Hoos, Evan Beamer, Abigail Shumway, and Camille Callahan. Research and fact-checking supervision by Stephen Ear. Audio editing and post-produced by Whit Lacasio and Cole Lacasio. Additional audio editing by Jordan Stidham. Mixed and mastered by Brendan Kane. Production coordination by Samantha Collins. Production support by Antonio Manata and Delana Corley. Artwork by Jessica Clogston-Kiner. Theme song called Something Wicked by Ross Bugden. Thank you for listening to the Mr. Ballin podcast. If you enjoyed today's story and you're looking for more bone-chilling content, be sure to check out all of our studio's podcasts. There's this one, the